Hello guys. In this video I'm continuing to clear my backlog of half-finished projects with this 3D printed late World War I Peugeot tank. This was 3D printed on my Halot Mage Pro 3D printer, and the water washable resin used in this video was supplied free of charge by Hostilities for the purpose of review. If you look on places like CG Trader, you'll find lots of models ready for 3D printing. You've got World War I tanks, World War II tanks, fantasy tanks, all kinds of things. I could have chosen any of them really, but for this project I wanted to do something which was quite unique, so I went for this Peugeot Char 1918, which is a late World War I French prototype tank. If you hadn't heard of that tank, don't worry, neither had I. It was a contemporary of the FT-17 tank, and in many ways very similar, except it doesn't have a rotatable turret. And it was armed with the 37mm gun. Only a single prototype of this tank was built. It was crewed by 2 men, and incredibly, we do have some archive footage of it. So I'll shut up for a moment while we watch that. In terms of kits of the Peugeot tank, we have a couple of options according to scalemates. In 1/35th scale we have several variations from Varga scale models. They're a company that makes short-run 3D printed kits, which I've reviewed in similar videos on my channel. And we have a version from Yellow House Club, also in 1/35th scale, which I believe is a resin kit. However, of course, I was going to print my own kit, so I loaded the downloaded file into my slicing software, in this case Chitubox, made sure it was all nicely supported, and 45 degrees tends to be the best angle to print for resin printers. These days I tend to use water washable resin in my 3D printers because it's a lot less hassle when it comes to post-processing. You don't have to mess around with IPA and so on. The water washable resin used in this video was supplied free of charge by Hostilities, I think that's how you pronounce it. This is their water washable Pro resin. It's slightly more expensive than regular resin, going for $37 or 29 British pounds for a kilo, so we'll see how it performs. I set the printer going, and 4 hours and 39 minutes later, this is what came out. As a reference point, the slicing software said that my older printer would take an extra 2 hours to print this same model, compared to the Mage Pro. I have cleaned things up at this point, so I've removed the supports, I've washed the resin and I've cured it. But here's a photo of a version of the tank I printed on an earlier printer, and this is the stack of supports that had to be removed from the underside. Obviously with so few reference photos it's quite hard to judge the accuracy of the model, but it certainly seems to me as if most major components are there. One thing that we don't have, and maybe that would be a common option in a plastic kit, but it seems less common in 3D printed kits, even though it should be quite easily possible, is the ability to open those rear doors on the turret. Well, it's not really a turret, is it? But those rear doors. But otherwise, I think that looks pretty decent. Of course, in terms of painting, there's very little we can say really about the colour of this tank. I went for a base coat of grey primer, followed by a base coat of Tamiya XF1 black. Now, when I got back into modelling maybe 6 or 7 years ago, one of the first things I bought was this set of British and German World War I colours from Ammo by MiG. And I've not really used them much. I do in particular like this colour 77 dull green, so I thought I'd give that a go and see what it looked like. Here is the model after giving it a coat of Halford's car primer and then a coat of black. I tend to prefer the car primer to the Tamiya fine primer for tasks like this. Now that black has highlighted a few areas where maybe there's a few sort of layer lines or slight imperfections which I can clean up before we move on to the top coats. And if you think that paint looks a bit glossy, it's because I accidentally picked up the semi-gloss black rather than the flat black. But that will make no difference once we get the top layer down. And here is the tank once we've applied a dull green colour to it. I really like this colour actually, although I feel that maybe it's a bit more German than French, but I really do like it. The difficulty here was painting the tracks because of course they're all one piece and they're attached already. Rather than airbrushing, I decided on Vallejo Metal Colours Steel, brush painted all over the track surfaces, inside and out. Been very careful to make sure that I get on all the insides of these teeth here. And using the same steel colour for the wheels. One thing I was very aware of with this model is that it is quite a uniform finish. It's a single colour paint scheme, it has no insignia or markings or anything like that, so I'd have to think of a few ways to make it a bit more interesting. Of course, a fairly standard way to do that is to add a pin wash, and I did that with the Abteilung 502 sepia oil paint, thinned with odourless thinner. This has been applied after the entire model has been given a coat of VMS flat varnish. As you can see, the flat varnish doesn't exactly help the pin wash flow, but it does help a little bit with sort of blending it into the existing paint scheme. Unfortunately, probably one of the limits of 3D printing here is that these big bolt heads are not quite as sharp as you would find on a plastic kit. Even with the pin wash, there aren't that many details on the model to stand out, apart from perhaps here on the side. As always with pin washes, they can be cleaned up for some time afterwards. And on the top of the tank here you can see a good example of where that needs to happen, where the pin wash has seeped into the rest of the paintwork, and we can just clear that up with a brush lightly dampened with odourless thinner. As well as trying to finish off my ongoing modelling projects, I'm also trying to use up some of the resources that I've been buying and perhaps not using as much as I should over the last few years. So I thought I'd start with this dark steel pigment. I can't remember why I bought this, but I've barely used it. And I thought I'd have a go at using it to make this front wheel look a bit more steel-like. So I put a healthy dose onto the wheel, tried to sort of blend it in a circular pattern, and then realised that actually it didn't really do that much after all, and it didn't look any different really with the pigment on compared to the pigment off. But it was a nice try. One thing I did find quite useful though to highlight the raised area of the tracks was to take a healthy amount of this pigment on a flat, fairly stiff brush and essentially dry brush it over the top of the tracks to give that polished look. from contact with the road. On that note, I also found the same technique was quite useful for highlighting some of the edges of the vehicle. I wasn't trying to give a sort of chipped effect or a worn away effect or anything like that, but just a slight hint that it is made out of metal, and maybe an attempt there to make it look heavier than it really is. So again, I sort of dry brushed those pigments around only the raised edges of the gun compartment, hinges, door handles, hatches, all that kind of stuff. And in particular, anything around the running gear. So pieces of the suspension, the small wheel at the back of the tank, etc., etc. One technique I've started using more recently to break up uniform paint jobs is oil paint splattering. In this case, I took the same sepia oil paint that I used for the pin wash, but I thinned it down a bit more, and I simply speckled it over the vehicle. The aim here is not to make any sort of definitely visible sort of mud splatter or anything like that. It's simply to slightly discolour the surface in a kind of speckled pattern that really isn't obviously noticeable to the eye, but would be noticeable if it wasn't there. It does look quite heavy as I'm doing it here, but of course all these techniques tend to fade once they've dried. I wanted to add a small amount of mud, so I referred to this weathering reference that I made a while ago, where I've just got samples of the various pigments and enamels that I use. I really like this bottom left one here. It says above plus earth, which is the European earth pigment combined with this enamel earth product from AK. I really like the colour of that, and I find this reference card really handy as well. They were mixed together with a small amount of thinner, but deliberately left fairly thick. You can see here at the start of my attempt I've left this a little bit too heavy on the brush, and so some of the splatters are a bit too big. But that will be easily fixed later. You'll also notice that the model is still damp at this stage from the sepia speckling effect that I did, but that's absolutely fine. You can see about now the speckles are getting a bit smaller, a bit finer, as the amount of product on the brush diminishes. I also applied that product directly onto some areas to simulate mud build-up. And if there are any areas that we don't like, we can take a fine brush dipped in odourless thinner and blend them out. That's not perfect on the side there because you can see it also cleans up that sepia splatter effect, but it's not a big problem. The tracks were a little bit more difficult because I just wasn't really sure what to do with them. They don't have a lot of features or spaces for mud to build up in, so I applied the same mix that I used for the mud splatter and then thinned it a bit more on the model using some more odourless thinner. I'm not sure how this will dry, but there's only one way of finding out. This is what it looked like the next day when everything was dry. Not bad, not brilliant. There were definitely a few hard edges here that didn't quite blend in properly, particularly with the mud, so I wanted to do something to fix that. I decided the best way was to take some of the European earth pigment, this time without the enamel, and use it to gently fade in those hard edges. I think once that was done, it looked a lot better. I did a similar thing on the tracks where there were some tide marks from the thinner to try to get a slightly more uniform look to those tracks. Finally, when I was happy with the European earth, I went back over the tracks with the stiff brush and the metal pigments. And with that, my model was complete. And there we go, guys, that was my build, well, not really build, but painting and weathering of the 3D printed Peugeot 1918 tank. I'm quite happy with the result here, and I'm really glad I've got an unusual piece to go on my model shelf. I really did enjoy painting and weathering this, and I do feel like I've done a good job of turning a fairly featureless box into something that looks a little bit more real. From a technical point of view, the 3D printer has done a good job. The Acidity resin has done a great job. I think one of the potential limitations is just in the resolution of the model. So for example, on some of the curves you can see the individual polygons that make it up, simply because there aren't really enough subdivisions there within them. That's quite evident around the fighting compartment. But I do think that the layer lines which were present on my previous 3D prints were not as prominent here, printed on the new 8K resin printer. I'm still a little bit on the fence about 3D printing large models like this. The biggest difficulty is always going to be finding quality 3D models. But of course I don't really have much to compare it with because this is such a rare subject for model kits. On the other hand, I think it's going to be a long time before I would 3D print something like a Panzer IV or a Tiger, just because of the sheer quantity of high quality kits that are out there. I do really love using 3D printing though to support my modelling, in particular with sort of accessories and even things like jerry cans and things like that, and figures which I've been printing a few more of recently and will be using in some future projects. I hope you enjoyed this video and the fairly simple weathering that I did on this model. That's another model on the shelf for me and a bit more space on my desk. I'm quite keen to start making the Blackbird models Manchester using a Lancaster from Airfix, but I'm just trying to hold off on that until I've got as many things that I can finished and cleared away. I'm hoping that next week's video will be the final version of the E60, which I produced a few weeks ago, painted in a nice late World War II inspired German camo scheme. If you'd like to see that video, then please remember to hit subscribe if you haven't already. I would like to say a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters and YouTube members. All of your support and feedback is massively appreciated, so if you have any comments, please do feel free to leave them below. Thank you once again for watching, and until next time, have fun modelling.